I want to speak a little bit about Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who is in the running for to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States in 2020. This is obviously a crowded field. There's at least 20 candidates. I've been watching the debates on and off, and I'll be making more videos specifically about those, although not very comprehensive, more like just some general talking points. But I want to talk a little bit about Congresswoman Gabbard because there's one aspect of her record that I find very problematic. I don't think she's going to get the nomination, but she's still in the race, and she is, I would say, a middle level contender. She's not to be taken lightly, although she's not on the par of, say, an Elizabeth Warren or a Kamala Harris or a Joe Biden or a Bernie Sanders, but she is still in the race. Little bit of background: Congresswoman Gabbard served in the Hawaii National Guard. She's still a major, I understand, so she's a veteran. Um, she's travelled. She's had experience. This is what I am very concerned about. It's her views on the Assad regime in Syria, her attitude to the Assad regime in Syria. In 2017, Congresswoman Gabbard made a visit, what her office calls a fact-finding visit to Syria for what she described as an effort to bring peace to the country. During this meeting, she met Bashar Assad. Now, this was 2017, 5 years into this horrible war. On the surface, you might think, well, she's being diplomatic, she's trying to get peace. Great. She's presidential. I look at it another way. I look at this with suspicion, and this is why. She said, she basically echoed the Kremlin Assad narrative that everyone, all the opposition that Assad is fighting, are terrorists. This is just factually wrong, but it indicates that she is playing straight into the playbook of a blood soaked dictator. Of course, there's some vicious elements fighting Assad. Everyone knows about ISIS, thankfully now almost defeated, and other Islamist groups. Groups that I would point out infiltrated this situation. They only got power, they only escalated their brutality or got influence after Russia and China vetoed condemnation of the Assad regime's use of force. I think that Gabbard is an isolationist, and I do not think that there's anything pacifist about basically serving as an apologist for a bloody, brutal dictator like Bashar Assad. I do not trust Gabbard. You know, she said the other day on CNN, if evidence comes to the fore to indicate that Assad's responsible for war crimes, he should be punished. But there's already abundant evidence showing this man's brutal disregard for human rights, his regime's use of torture, indiscriminate murder, raining down barrel bombs on civilian areas. Even if you put question marks on the Gauta chemical attack, and independent observers have suggested that in all likelihood it was almost certainly the Assad regime that was responsible. They didn't categorically say it was the Assad regime, but they said the type of weapons used and the way that those were dropped, the way that that was done, only government could have done that. So even if you want to say it's a all one big conspiracy theory, no one can rationally dispute that Bashar Assad is a nice man. He is a brutal dictator. And I find it frankly rather sickening that this woman thought it was appropriate to reach out to him in this way. And here's my question. If it was really about bringing peace to the Syrian people, because she said you have to reach out to all parties, so why did she not also reach out to the opposition? Why is she calling them terrorists? That's not being neutral, that's not being diplomatic. This has echoes of Jeremy Corbyn and the IRA on a bigger scale. And this is the problem. Because of her status as a veteran, her supporters will say that she has a moral high ground. But I think people are making a mistake if they view all foreign policy through the prism of, well, Iraq was a disaster, so the government's always lying and we can't trust any. If you take that position, if you view all foreign policy through the spectrum of the disaster that was the Iraq War, then America, it follows, should never intervene anywhere because of the disaster of the Iraq War. And that to me is an incredibly reckless position to have. Syria and Iraq are not the same situation at all. It was the Assad regime that started this war. It wasn't a Western coalition that started the war, which was the case in Iraq. It was the Assad regime that started this war with his brutal response to legitimate protests. These weren't Islamist terrorists rising up, these were ordinary Syrians, fed up of human rights abuses, fed up of high unemployment, fed up of the basic rights being trampled. The same sort of things that triggered people in other parts of the Arab world at the time of Arab Spring. And one of the biggest distortions, I think, of the last 10 years has been that because Islamists have infiltrated these conflicts, because of a vicious death cult like ISIS got in there, and everyone agrees ISIS is a vicious death cult, that kind of serves the narrative, to some people at least, that, oh well, if Assad is fighting ISIS, he must be the good guy. The reality is not that black and white. And I think Tulsi Gabbard is tapping into the sort of school of thought that Ron Paul had. And she's presenting herself as a pacifist. But there's nothing pacifist, there's nothing noble about serving as the devil's advocate for a bloody dictator. Literally a bloody dictator. And you know what? There's a huge amount of, I could just tell the mentality. Tulsi Gabbard supporters will come here and say, I'm a hawk. I want America to go to war. And that's the sort of narrative that you see. That's the sort of dual mentality these people have. Well, my question to them is, what do you do about a brutal dictator that is massacring his own people? I mean, the fact that Russia Today, Russia Insider, and Sputnik News, all mouthpieces of the Kremlin, support this woman, to me that speaks volumes. No, it doesn't mean that she's working for Russia. There's no evidence for that. But there was a skit on this on Showtime. I think it was Showtime. Yeah, they done a skit on the first Democratic debate, and they kind of, it was parody, it was satire. They said, "Russia plant Tulsi Gabbard." Now that's perhaps unfair, but the wrath that her supporters are showing in the comments, they were saying things like, "Oh, they're only attacking her. The establishment's only attacking her because she's against war." Being against war doesn't automatically give someone moral high ground. I don't think there's any moral high ground in being an apologist for a dictatorship. And as far as I'm concerned, she is little better than an apologist for a very evil man. She's no better than that Canadian journalist, Eva Bartlett. And the fact that this woman is looking at the White House, I hope, if she does go further, if it gets narrowed down and she is in the top kind of five candidates left, I hope she is really put on the spot. CNN raised this issue the other day, but I would have liked to see them or anyone, right? You can say CNN's biased. I would like to see anyone say, Congresswoman Gabbard, what exactly did you say to Bashar Assad? No one has asked that yet. No one has really put her on the spot and said, this is a man who is guilty. There's no doubt about it. Guilty of severe human rights abuses. Even if you doubt the chemical attacks, there's plenty of other things that would make Assad a war criminal. And my problem with the position that she is playing straight into the Kremlin narrative of saying that it's all one big conspiracy for America to go to war in Syria. It is such a problem to view the world, to view foreign policy through the prism of Iraq and all the problems with that, because that is a very compelling argument. She'll say, we know what happens when the government misleads us. Look at Iraq, right? And that's an emotive thing. people will buy into that. They'll say, yeah, she's absolutely right. They lied to us. But if you look at foreign policy through the mistakes of Iraq, through the blunders of Iraq, through the disaster of Iraq, then it follows that you think America should never intervene ever. I mean, I'd even make World War analogies here. One of the reasons America was so reluctant to get into World War II was because America, like many European countries before the war broke out, still had memories of World War One. You know, they had memories of the trenches. 100,000 Americans died in the First World War. And I think the Tulsi Gabbards and the Ron Pauls of this world think that because Iraq was such a disaster, then all intervention is bad. I think that is incredibly reckless. It's an incredibly reckless way to look at things. What would a President Gabbard do about a brutal dictator massacring his own people? Would her attitude be, oh, well, it's none of our business, we'll just turn a blind eye? That's not leadership. So I really have a problem with this idea that appeasing dictators, that apologizing for dictators, that meeting dictators but not putting them on the spot. I mean, did she ask Assad about his human rights record? Even if she did, he would have given her he would have just lied to her face because Assad is a pathological liar. The biggest deception of this decade, if put it this way, if the biggest deception of the 2000s was the Iraq War, the biggest deception of the 2010s is that Assad's a good guy simply fighting terrorists. It sickens me the influence that Russia has on Western democracy, and the fact that Russian networks support her should raise question marks. Russia's hardly a pacifist country. So please, let's not frame her position as pacifist, as anti war. There's nothing peaceful about appeasing a dictator. That is why I think this woman cannot be trusted. You know, if she had met the opposition as well, I'd be looking at it a different way. I'd be thinking, okay, she's being a statesperson, she's reaching out. But the fact she only met Assad and immediately said, oh, he's fighting terrorists, that is absolutely playing into his playbook. It's absolutely towing his narrative. That's an absolute disgrace. And also, from a legal perspective, she may have violated the Logan Act, in which elected representatives are meant to declare for trips to foreign governments, especially those that are hostile to the United States. Her office denies this, but I think that's yet another question mark around all of this. So if Gabbard gets closer to the White House, you would essentially have someone who's an apologist for brutal dictators. Now, to be fair, one could argue Trump is as well. Trump's been kowtowing to a lot of dictators. Okay, I understand realpolitik. I understand you can't simply have a situation where you only do trading, you only talk to people that you're ideologically aligned with. That's not the real world. But we're now 8 years into this brutal war in Syria. Assad's crimes are well documented by independent sources. This this dangerous notion the Russian propaganda has put out that she is pandering to, her position is an insult to every victim of this evil man. I know Syrians. They hate ISIS, they hate the Islamist groups. They also hate Assad. You know, is Congresswoman Gabbard going to speak to Syrian refugees, people who fled this evil man?